Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon. I'm president of the Center for American Progress. Really honored to have you all here. Transportation has bridged American communities for generations. As the second largest expense for American households, let me say that again, the second largest expense for American households, it impacts the lives of American workers every day. But too many communities have been left out of the decision-making process. As we celebrate the Transportation Department's 50th anniversary this year, it's time to put our infrastructure dollars back to work. It's more important than ever that we connect more American communities to opportunities and give everyone, no matter their income or their zip code, a fair shot at success. We're really honored to have Secretary Anthony Foxx here today, because for the past 3 years, Secretary Foxx has worked tirelessly to usher in a new era of American transportation policy, challenging lawmakers to address crucial deficiencies in our nation's infrastructure. Under his leadership, the Department of Transportation has fostered new innovations and investments to help American cities better serve all of their residents, leaving no one behind. Today, Secretary Foxx will lay out his vision for how we can build on the progress and ensure that a more inclusive transportation future. Please join me in welcoming the 17th U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Foxx.
So good morning, everyone. It's great to be here at CAP. Neera, thank you so much and your team for welcoming my team here to the Center for American Progress. And before I get into the presentation, I thought I would just ask, just by a show of hands, how people got here today. How many people came by car to CAP today? Okay, how about metro, train? All right, very good. Anybody Uber here or Lyft? Have to be fair, and anybody bike or walk? Oh, excellent, wonderful. Well, this, as you might imagine, is a conversation I have every day and almost every moment of every day. How do people get from one place to another, and what are the most efficient, effective, safe ways that people can move? But I also have begun thinking about transportation in a slightly different way, which is to think about what transportation does, not just from place getting, but also in terms of place making. What does transportation mean as it relates to how we build community? And I'm going to spend some time talking about that subject today. But the first thing that I wanted to get to was we have to kind of get into the frame of mind here. So let's think about the design of our built environment and how many decisions get made and get made with choices having been presented. And I guess one of the ways that I can talk about this is to maybe get out of transportation for a second and to get to something, or at least a team that I happen to love very much, which is the New York Yankees. If you look at this, there's just a simple baseball stadium, Yankee Stadium. But one thing about the way the stadium is arranged is that the home plate actually faces northeast. And there's actually a rule of Major League Baseball, Rule 1.04, that specifies that the home plate is supposed to face northeast. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is because when the plate faces in that direction, that's the one direction you can face where the sunlight will not fall onto the batter's eyes. And so not every Major League stadium adheres to this as rigidly as Yankee Stadium does. But it's interesting to note that folks thought so much about the design of a baseball stadium that minor detail is something that was actually thought about and codified in Major League Baseball rules. Now, the stadium is great, the team's better, and one of the reasons why the team's so good is because of the pitching. But anyway, we'll keep moving. It's a non sequitur. So let me get to the highway system. In the 1950s, President Dwight Eisenhower launched our interstate highway program, and the federal government started funding up to 90% of project costs in order to build a nationwide connected highway system. It started with 8 miles in Kansas and eventually grew into one of the most expansive and impressive networks the world has ever seen. As we all know, it has served as a major engine of our economy for decades, and highways were designed to get people largely from rural and suburban areas into urban cores as quickly as possible. Inevitably, highways did run through folks' backyards, and as a result, protests arose across the country called highway revolts, and really it became very clear that folks really didn't want these highways in their backyards. We now know overwhelmingly, though, that our urban freeways were routed through low-income and minority communities. And so instead of connecting us to each other, in some ways our highways have represented a separation. Now, if you lived in an area slated for a highway project, you had to move, and that also had severe impacts for people and for families. Remember, a lot of this activity and a lot of the decisions were made prior to the federal civil rights legislation, prior to the Voting Rights Act. And so decision makers really thought of low-income and minority communities as, in many ways, the communities of least resistance. And that's reflected in how the transportation system was built in the early days. In fact, certain of those values are still embedded in the infrastructure that we see today and use today. The man who envisioned the highway system was the longtime director of the former U.S. Bureau of Public Roads, Thomas McDonald. And he said that his goal was to get farmers out of the mud. A very worthy goal, by the way. In a speech to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, McDonald advocated displacing people in order to get those farmers out of the mud. And he said that destroying low-income areas with highways would, in effect, serve a higher and more legitimate purpose, converting them into a public asset. McDonald had a compatriot in Robert Moses, the country's infamous highway designer. He was even more blunt when he said that plowing freeways through low-income areas would make Baltimore a healthier city in the long run. These were the leading voices in the country as the highway movement took off in its early days, and their views were widely embraced and took root all over America, including a sleepy southern city that I happen to know well, Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where I grew up. This is actually the house I grew up in. It's on Crestdale Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina. My grandparents bought the house in 1961, and early on the neighborhood contained a small network of interconnected streets. Later, federal money and state decision-making led to two highways surrounding the neighborhood, destroying the connective tissue. Neighbors were separated from neighbors. The corner store was gone because the corner was gone. A new, more convenient, high-speed thoroughfare had been created, but the way of life in that particular community had been changed forever. I grew up living with these barriers, and even though I had no idea how they came to be or what caused them, I had no sense at the time that it wasn't just physical barriers that I was seeing. They were also psychological and economic barriers. But in fact, this area was not an area where you had chain grocery stores. It wasn't an area where you had pharmacies. It wasn't an area where the doctor's office was located. And part of that was because it was harder to get to. It became clear to me only later that these freeways were carrying people through my area, but not really to it. Businesses didn't invest there, and later I became a city councilman and then mayor, and I was then involved in decisions about putting new roads out, putting new transit lines out, even rezoning cases, and it occurred to me at that time how much thought actually does go into these decisions. The people in my community at the time these decisions were made were actually not invisible. It is just that at a certain stage in our history, they didn't matter. Now, there's another community in Charlotte, an older community that we'll talk about some, called Brooklyn. This is not Brooklyn, New York, by the way. It was, however, a thriving African-American community home to churches and schools and doctors' offices and lawyers and theaters. And it was the heartbeat of that community. When folks like Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington came to Charlotte, they might play in some other venue, but they would stay in this area. And there's no trace of it today because it was systematically eliminated. By 1912, the local paper captured the prevailing views that Brooklyn was far too valuable to be left to African Americans. And they wrote, in fact, far-sighted men believe that eventually this section, because of its proximity to the center of the city, must sooner or later be utilized by the white population. And then in the 1930s, as happened in many communities across the country, the area was redlined by federal policies, meaning that mortgage loans were assessed as risky. So people couldn't take out loans to buy or improve their homes. And by 1947, the Planning Commission had labeled the area as an industrialized zone. And that, of course, was fantastic for property values. And then in the 1960s, a new urban renewal program brought a mass slum clearance effort that wiped the community off the map. And throughout all of this, infrastructure decisions aided and abetted the destruction of this community. First came Independence Boulevard. Oops. Now I'm all crossed up. Sorry, folks. Now I think the computer is upset with me. First came Independence Boulevard, which cut a gash through the community, and later an inner beltway, which was I-277, which remains to this day. And so the images that you saw of Brooklyn as it was being raised were really the last and enduring image that people who lived there remember of that community. Okay. So now you're starting to see the development of the freeway system in the Charlotte area. And even before I-77 and 85, which you saw earlier, the system evolved in an east-west, north-south fashion and then followed by a circumferential interstate that was built around it. Today, if you live near a freeway, the chances are you're poor. And if you want to use Charlotte as a bit of an example, this is a map in the 1960s as the highway system was being built. The blue areas represent higher income areas of the city, and the red areas represent the lower income areas of the city. As the system matured by 2013, this is what it looked like. Almost a direct correlation between where the poverty is and where the highways are. We actually took a look at total household displacement in the first 20 years of the construction of the interstate system. And we found that a majority of people displaced were, in fact, people of color. And if you add urban renewal programs on top of that, what like has happened in Charlotte, roughly 2/3 of the families displaced were low income. And many of those were African American. People were forced to sell their homes at below market value, taking their main source of wealth. Many still live on the edges of our freeways, and of course they paid a heavy price, but I would argue now the rest of us are paying a heavy price for this displacement. And the reason I say that is because in areas in this country where infrastructure is supposed to connect people, in some places it's actually constraining them. And as we look to how we create more opportunity and close the income inequality gaps that we have in this country, our infrastructure is going to have to play a role in helping us do that. As I've surveyed the country, this correlation is not unique to Charlotte. And in place after place, highways cut the heart out of poor areas. For example, in Miami, the Overtown community, which actually was an African-American middle-class community, was bifurcated by I-95. In Staten Island, they referred to the Expressway as the Mason-Dixon line. In St. Paul, there was a highway that cut through a predominantly African American community, and just last year, the mayor of St. Paul actually issued an apology for those decisions. In New Orleans, the Claiborne Expressway dredged up a green space in the Tremaine neighborhood, and in Los Angeles, the Century Expressway affected. There's 7 of those expressways that have led to the decay of many poor communities there. And in Seattle, I-5 basically bifurcated a very white blue-collar part of Seattle. And even in rural areas like in Iowa, this is south of Des Moines, and I-35, farmers were forced to give up some of their land to make way for I-35. And then there's West Baltimore. A generation ago, as I mentioned, Robert Moses wanted to plow through West Baltimore into an area called Harlem Park. The project eventually was stopped, but Harlem Park was actually destroyed in the process. Today, a majority of West Baltimore residents have neither a car nor access to transit to get to a job. And so there's still a gap there. After years and years, a new transit project called the Red Line was put forward. We had planned to commit about $1 billion to this project, only to have it canceled by the state of Maryland. It's not just highways, by the way. I've spent a lot of time. The truth is we need highways. I'm not anti-highway, by the way. But I think we could talk about just about any of our modes of transportation, and in some way or another, the same story rings true. So let's look at our airports, for example. This is the St. Louis International Airport. They were looking to do some runway expansions in the 1980s, and there were concerns about future expansions and air noise. And airport officials basically launched a purchase of land in Kinloch, Missouri. That was actually a well-populated African-American community. I don't know if this is going to work. I'm told that it won't, but I'll try it anyway. Here's a picture of Kinloch before the airport was built. And I don't know if we can make the picture come up of the after story, Jason. Okay, all right. Basically, these areas were basically flattened. And I think the interesting thing about that is where the people went. Most of them, or many of them, ended up moving to a small town called Ferguson. And so this is a story that goes back 30 plus years. It's not just airports. Look at our basic sidewalk infrastructure. This is Atlanta, Georgia. But it really could be any part of our country. And you see these roads are really designed for cars, not for people. There are no sidewalks. And where you see sidewalks, there are no crosswalks. So I want you to imagine you're a mother and you're ending a 90-minute trip to the grocery store on a bus. You're carrying bags of groceries and you have your 3 kids with you, and your house is 85 feet across the street from the bus stop. Now the next crosswalk happens to be about 1/3 of the mile either north or south of where you are. And I'm not going to ask you, because I'd have to have you all arrested, how many of you would take the 85-foot trip across the street? Well, on this particular day, the mother, Raquel Nelson, took that 85-foot chance. 2 of her kids ran out in front of her. Her son, AJ, chased after his sister, and AJ was struck and killed by a car. And I want to tell you, this accident is a tragedy. But what's even more tragic is that it's not an isolated case, not in Atlanta and not in this country. This is a map of bike and pedestrian fatalities, in Atlanta between 2001 and 2013. The areas of gray represent concentrations of poverty. This is representative of what's occurring nationally, which is not surprising because only 49% of low-income neighborhoods have sidewalks at all. And that's compared to 90% of higher income areas. So if we want a society in which everyone has a real shot no matter where they come from, then it's imperative that we acknowledge that these divisions, past and present, still exist. We still live with them. And that the concrete and steel and asphalt in this country plays a role in how people connect themselves to opportunity. Transportation does get us places. That is a lot of what we do. But transportation also makes places. And it can make good places, or it can make places that are harder to get out of. So, how did all this happen? You might ask. Well, I would argue that it happened because of a combination of federal money and state and local decision making. The federal government puts about $60 billion into our surface transportation system every year. 90% of that money goes to the states by virtue of a set formula. When we look at state transportation, look at surface transportation spending across the country, 98% of all surface transportation expenditures are actually made at the state and local level. So the same state, local, and federal partnership that created these problems has an equally powerful ability to solve them. And that's what I really want to turn to now. Abraham Lincoln once said that the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do at all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In other words, government exists really to do what we can't do on our own. And transportation is one of those things that we can't do on our own. Can you imagine all of us trying to dig our way, dig roads out for the places that only we want to go? It's not the way it works. We do this together. And I think the question that we have to begin asking is, what kind of country do we want to build? What kind of connection do we want to have to each other? Frankly, what kind of fabric are we trying to weave in this country? And we have to acknowledge that the fabric that was woven into past decision makings was not in all cases an inclusive fabric. That doesn't mean that's how it's got to be going forward, though. And I believe we can and we should and we must choose a different path going forward. So what does that look like? Well, first, we've got to acknowledge that transportation not only connects people to opportunity, but transportation also creates opportunity. A lot of times we think of transportation as just throughput. So I can get someone from a low-income area to a job. But we've actually seen examples where transportation actually creates jobs in that community. And so we've got to think about projects in this country that do both of those things. So let me show you an example from where I come from. This is the Charlotte Blue Line light rail system. The first segment opened in 2007, and it occupied a part of the city that was basically low-income area, and a combination of that and abandoned industrial facilities, warehouses and things. And the area was full of underserved neighborhoods. And today it's now populated by new housing, new neighborhood services, and restaurants. And the area has come to life with almost $2 billion of investment in just that area alone. But to be honest, Charlotte was prepared to go north-south with its transit line, but not into its most struggling areas on the east and west corners of the city. And so we worked to push for something, a streetcar that would connect the east and west portions of the city. Not without controversy, by the way. But the idea was to create a catalyst for development in those areas too. So we have examples of where transportation can actually attract jobs, neighborhood services, restaurants, the things that a lot of us take for granted that people in those communities don't. So I think transportation can do that. Secondly, while we can't change the past, we can ensure that current and future transportation projects do connect and strengthen communities, including areas that have in the past been on the wrong side of transportation decisions. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, which is that, Mr. Secretary, this sounds like a really expensive proposition. But I've actually thought about this, and here's the answer. The answer is that we are reaching a time when our infrastructure is aging. We have a lot of bridges, a lot of roads, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt or replaced. And so this is a perfect time to begin thinking about how we do it better than we did it the last time. And there are many projects across the country. I won't care to mention them, but there are plenty of projects around the country where a redesign, a realignment, rethinking could be done, I believe, at a neutral cost. So, but we do have examples. Now, the other piece of this is that we're also growing as a country, so we're going to need new infrastructure. We have 70 million more people that are going to be looking to move around over the next 30 years. We're going to have 45% more pressure on our freight systems, 65% more trucks on the road, and so we're going to have to build new infrastructure. So let's build infrastructure that creates the connective tissue this country needs. Let me show you an example. This is a gathering that occurred, I think it was last summer, in Columbus, Ohio, on something called the Long Street Bridge. Now, I'll show you this rendering here, which is an aerial view of this bridge. This bridge crosses I-71, which in the 1960s bifurcated the King Lincoln community on one side and the Central Business District on the other. Before this highway existed, those two areas were connected. Well, that creates not only physical separation, but frankly, it creates a bit of a lack of access for people who live on the other side of the Central Business District. And for years, folks have been trying to figure out how to reconnect. Eventually, the Ohio Department of Transportation came up with an idea to cap the freeway. And so what you're looking at is a restorative project that has actually reconnected that community to the Central Business District of King Lincoln. And if you talk to residents there, they will talk about what it was like before and how good it feels to now be reconnected and to have that access point. Finally, and frankly, I think had we been better about this 60 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had some of these problems. But we've got to be better in the transportation sector at building infrastructure by, for, and with the communities we serve. Now, there's an old maxim in transportation called DAD. Decide, advocate, and defend, and do it all before the public's involved. And that's got to stop. And so part of what we're trying to do is raise awareness with the public that we expect public input processes to be meaningful. And I think that when transportation departments listen to the public and actually have to pay attention to the concerns they have, the output is better. Let me show you an example of that. This is Ladea Epps. Ladea Epps actually lives in Crenshaw, Los Angeles. That's where we're building a light rail line in this community. No one would have thought that 30 years ago we'd be building a light rail line in Crenshaw. But this line is actually doing what the transit project in Charlotte was doing, is attracting new jobs, new neighborhood services, new vitality into Crenshaw. But one of the things we did is we started a local hire pilot where we allow contractors to hire people who live in the community where a project's being built. And Ladea is an example of this. She says that she never would have thought she'd be in a career constructing things, but now she believes that more women should be doing it because they do the job better. So that's Ladea's story, but it's a story that we're starting to see more and more of across the country. So I want to end here by kind of surveying a few things we're doing at DOT beyond what I've talked about. You know, transportation really tends to be a ground-up business. So meaning that the projects that come to us to support are coming to us from local government, they're coming from state government. And so if those projects are projects that create better connective tissue, a more connected America, we're going to be able to do that. But we have to do it one project at a time, one local government at a time, one state at a time, one community at a time, and eventually we will repair some of this stuff that we've had to inherit over time. But without a robust public input and without a very enlightened set of decision makers at the state level, we can't do it. So let me tell you some things we've been trying to do to help ferment this in the country. We've made making access to opportunity a priority for discretionary funding in programs such as Tiger and a Ladders of Opportunity transit program. For instance, in Texas, we gave the state more than $20 million that will provide rural transportation services across the state and provide low-income people with disabilities affordable and reliable transportation and access to jobs. Or in Richmond, Virginia, where if you live in West Richmond, between the hours of 7 and 9 o'clock, I think about 26% of the population has access to transit to get to East Richmond, where many of the jobs are. I may have that backwards, but the point is you've got a low percentage of people who can use transit to get to work. We're going to double that with a bus rapid transit program that we gave $25 million to Richmond to support to ensure that economically distressed communities do have access to jobs and good work. You may remember the story of James Robertson, who captured the nation's attention last year by walking 21 miles round trip to his job in Detroit because he had no car and because the buses were so unreliable. Our programs have actually supported restoring the Detroit bus system. We're putting new buses in Detroit. Those buses should be running on time. They previously had half of their bus fleet that was under a state of disrepair. So we're going to get them back on time. We're also carrying out other opportunity-focused initiatives like Ladder Step, which was a program that we isolated those cities that have had the most trouble getting people from poverty to middle-class lifestyles. We've gone to 7 cities across the country and asked them which transportation projects can most help in that area. And in those cities, we're working on those projects today. Safer People, Safer Streets, a program designed to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety and mobility and to help send best practices out across the country. Rides to Wellness, and so many other great programs we're doing. We're updating our standards and promoting connectivity to help planners better measure how their networks are actually working for people. We're updating planning requirements to make decision makers more responsive and accountable. And overall, we're putting our money where our mouth is in the FY17 budget by proposing $20 billion a year to reconnect communities, expand transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, and incentivize coordinated regional land use planning. And we've also worked to change the culture in our department by further empowering our Office of Civil Rights and naming the first Chief Opportunity Officer in the federal government. But as I said before, the department can't do it alone. And so we're asking decision makers across the country to support these principles. We're also asking the public to speak up when they see something being determined that they don't like. Be part of the process and make sure your voices are heard, and know that the U.S. Department of Transportation is going to do the best job we can of trying to help. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll ask you a few questions, and I think we'd like to have some time for audience questions. I think I really wanted to start where you ended, which is most transportation dollars really are moving out at the state and local level. And so, there have been people who've argued that maybe we should rethink that mix, in part because states and localities don't have a good history of how they're allocating these dollars, as you really well demonstrated. So are there policy or changes? Do we really think we should have so much of the dollars just flowing through the states? Can they be trusted to not replicate the poor decisions that have been made in the past?
So I'd say a couple of things. First, I think on balance, things are much better today in the decision-making process than they were back in 1956. And so I do want to give due credit to that. I would also say, though, that most of the money that we send out goes into the states.
Mm-hmm.
And the states are making many of these decisions with very little local input. And one of the things I believe is that we actually should be pushing more money to the local
Right,
governments.
to cities and,
To the cities,
metro
yeah.
areas.
Yes, because those places, that's where people really have to live together. They have to live with the consequences of their decisions, and they have to talk to each other. And I think that in this era, we could actually see much better outcomes if we gave more local governments the ability to move transportation dollars.
That's a great point. On a whole range of issues, you see more metro regions. So it's not just the city, but there are areas working together that are making these decisions. And are there ways that we could push on a policy level to make sure some of those dollars really flow directly to metro areas? Because as you pointed out, it's really states and
Yeah, I really believe that we have underutilized our metropolitan planning organizations. I served as the chair of one, and we had a lot of federal requirements, but very little federal money, and
Yeah.
it doesn't make a lot of sense the way we do it. So I would actually say let's give the MPOs a real mission, and let's give them real resources, and let them start doing more projects. And if you go to California, many of the MPOs there have their own dedicated revenue system. The state gives them a big allocation, and they're actually doing projects. But that's an outlier. It's actually unusual, but I think that's more of the way we should do. The other thing about that I think is important is that I think Washington is a terrible place to sort out the balance between urban, suburban, rural issues. And I think MPOs are actually a great place because, again, people do have to live together. They are neighbors. And making those decisions together, I think, makes our country stronger.
And one broader topic is that we invest a lot in surface transportation as a country. We do invest a lot in roads, etc. Where do you see subways and other issues like that? We are seeing that younger people, millennials, are actually using subways more than older generations. In the mix of investments at the federal, state, and local level, do you see more going to systems that are much more urban in their focus?
So I think we are still in 1956 in terms of how we fund transportation. We still expect people to use gas guzzlers to help pay for our system, and that's becoming less and less true. We also still expect most of the money to go into highways, and we're not as flexible as I think we should be. I think if we were more flexible, we could have a more demand-driven transportation system that would actually respond to the millennials' desire to have more access to public transit, to have more bike ped facilities and things like that. So I actually, I would like to see us kind of take the handcuffs off of how our money's used and let the local governments and the state governments have more flexibility so they're actually responding to the unique needs they have.
And I'll go to audience questions right after this. But you referenced Charlotte and your experience as mayor. But I'd love in the kind of examples, both in the past and more recently, of trying to address these issues. How did your time actually as mayor shape your views on these topics?
Well, what being mayor really helped me understand was that these decisions weren't accidental. They were actually very well thought out. They just were in a time capsule that I think many of us wish we could replay again and do differently.
Yeah.
Land use, transportation, alignment, right-of-way acquisition, impact on neighborhoods. You think about all those things when you're doing this, and that's what's so distressing in a way about this, but that's also what's so empowering as we think about what we can do going forward.
Great. We have time for some questions. If you just identify yourself. Sorry, who are you with?
Ed Mikestrom with Agra Pulse Communications.
Okay.
Okay, it's Agriculture, communication.
Great.
Yes, question on rural transportation. Most of your presentation was on urban. And two questions. Basically, when you talk, what are your thoughts, Secretary Fox, what are your thoughts when you talk about the smarter way maybe to spend rural transportation funding in rural areas, in small towns and farms and counties, et cetera? And secondly, when you mentioned more control of spending decisions at the local level, are you talking about local rural counties and that sort of thing? Thank you.
No, I think the MPO RPO process is a vehicle that could be used more as a repository for federal investment. It is supposed to be indirectly through the state formula allocation, but I think the real power is not always reflected by the MPOs and the RPOs. I think rural America is a real challenge because, as Nira pointed out in her opening, the cost of transportation to families, particularly those on the margins, is humongous. And if you're in rural America, almost by definition, you have to own a car, or you have to be in a place that has really good rural transit. And I think this is a place where the loss of our strong inner-city passenger rail system has actually impacted rural America about as much as any place else, because the old story of people getting on the train and going to work and coming back in the evening, that's a story I'd like to see America live again, because that's one of the ways we can lower the cost of transportation for folks, get them access to jobs, but also allow them to have more flexibility with their income.
Further?
Thank you, Secretary Fox, for these principles. I'm very excited about it. My name is Cynthia Gerald. I'm the Federal Policy Director for Gamaliel and our transportation campaign, which is the Transportation Equity Network. We're a faith-based community organizing network in 17 states across the country. You mentioned ways that you were trying to implement these principles. I think it sounds great. You talked about actually going to decision makers at the state and local level. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to actually working with the grassroots community networks across the country, because I think they have a lot of impact on what local and state decision makers will actually do.
Yeah, no, we are very open to this. What I want to do with this conversation is really spark a conversation, because we are going to be rebuilding and replacing a lot of infrastructure. We're going to be building new infrastructure. And if we just lay down and say, let's do it like we did it 50, 60 years ago, we're going to get the same results. On the other hand, if we think more broadly and more openly about how transportation can actually play a restorative role, how it can create more of a national fabric of opportunity, I think we will come up with some great ideas. And I don't even know that I've thought about all of them. So I welcome the input of the grassroots community, both to us at USDOT, but frankly, just as importantly, to the state and local leaders who will also be on the hot seat making these decisions.
Right here? Front? In the front right here with the blue tie. And then we'll go behind him.
Good morning, Secretary Fox. David Elfin from Transport Topics.
Yes.
Been to several of your appearances. You always cite those freight stats about 45% growth and 65% growth. This obviously has been people-driven, which is important, obviously, but we ultimately got to get goods to people.
Sure.
We're in an era where drones are happening, online shopping's I don't know how you can put it, it's incredibly hot. What about freight going forward? How do you see that fitting into this picture?
Yeah, I don't think the topics are mutually exclusive. I think it's actually complementary. What I'm saying basically is that at the local and state levels, we've got to think about mobility differently. I'll give you an example. There's a conversation happening in many of our most densely populated areas around the country about whether you add highway lane miles or you add transit facilities, for example, or bike ped facilities for that matter. And I come from a school of thought that you look at the last time you did something and you try to figure out what happened. And if you look at the last time we added lane miles, we got more traffic. And so, I think we should be looking at things that give us opportunities to get people off the road if we can, give them a choice. And that actually creates more capacity for our freight systems. Now, when it comes to design, which is part of what we're also talking about here, I think design can be done at a cost-neutral level, but it could be done in a way that has a more of a place-making mindset as opposed to a place-getting mindset. We've actually never told our transportation professionals to think outside of the mode of transportation they're focusing on, but think about what we're doing as place-making. I mean, look at how many lane miles we have across the country. We have more than 40,000 miles of highway across the country, and every inch of that 40,000 miles is someplace. So let's make those places that if you had to wake up every morning and look at them, let's try to make them look like something you'd want to look at. So I just think there's a lot of ways this can get dealt with at a revenue neutral level, but at a level where we're putting a focus not just on getting people through and freight through, but making sure that it's effective placemaking.
Yes, I'm Charlie Clark, reporter with Government Executive. You have about 10 months left in the administration. I'm wondering what realistically you're hoping to accomplish and if you're trimming sails or expanding ambitions during the final 10 months.
No, not trimming anything. We've actually, a lot of the things I talked about up here are things we've been working on for the entire time I've been at the department. And while we're talking about this issue now, and it's actually been the product of a lot of work we've been doing all along. So my hope is that by creating a national conversation about the role transportation plays in opportunity, that John Q. Citizen says, you know what, I'm going to go to this community input session on the road project coming down the pike, or the mayor or the governor or the state transportation official starts to say, you know what, we're getting ready to build something in this area. People are upset about it. Let me really talk to them about how this is going to be designed and see if we can make some improvements. Those conversations are incredibly important. But if people feel like they've lost before they play the game, that's where we lose. And so that's why having a national conversation is important. But rest assured, there's plenty backing up what I'm doing in terms of how we're managing things at the department.
And I think we have one last question here.
Thank you, Secretary Foxx. My name's Tom Gage with Marconi Pacific. We're a technology consulting firm. I wonder what your thoughts are on vehicle automation and the implications of that for surface transportation. You've initiated a Smart Cities program for a $50 million challenge. I think that's terrific, honestly. It'll begin to set a sort of a plan for the country. But it feels like this needs a bigger view, sort of a 20-year, 30-year view. The cities are ill-equipped, the states are ill-equipped for the most part to think this through. This is a very big change. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, let me answer the question two ways. First way is, I think your observation is correct that the wave of technological innovation is coming very quickly, and as a general rule, our transportation communities, particularly in the public sector, we're not leading indicators of that. I'll put it that way, and trying to be charitable. So we have to figure out how to get people in the public sector thinking about how this transportation technology is going to impact them, how it's going to improve mobility, how it's going to impact what they do. And that's where the Smart City Challenge comes in, is we're actually asking cities to develop their visions for how technology intersects with the needs they have long term. And we've gotten a lot of different types of answers back from that. We've winnowed the challenge down to 7, but we got 78 submissions. and we're going to try to work with each of those communities to try to get those submissions moved through in other programs that we have. But what I would say is that I don't know all of the different manifestations of how technology is going to impact cities. But what I do know is that by seeding the effort of cities to actually think about these things, we will start to get those answers. Now, the other part of this that I want to say that relates to this presentation is that if you have a bunch of cool technology that requires a smartphone, what if I don't have a smartphone? And so as we think about what a smart city is, I frankly think a smart city is one that thinks about that issue too. And so we're gonna have a lot of interesting conversations over decades about this, but hopefully we can start with an inclusive view of how technology and transportation create more opportunity.
Great. I just want to finish with one brief question, which is, you know, I think we all, and definitely at the Center for American Progress, applaud your focus on inclusion and towards transportation policy. I guess regardless who the next president is, how do we build on this thinking? How do we ensure that it's not just an issue of federal policy, state and localities, people, as you're really focused, as you've made this really phenomenal point that we got to get communities also focused on it, but the connection between real opportunity and transportation is fundamental, as you really well laid out. So how do we build on that, make that case?
It's a great question, and I really think a lot of it comes from really having a strong push with our Congress on this topic, because you know we went through a lot. There's some expletives I could probably use to get a highway bill passed this last year, but success in that forum was getting a highway bill passed. If you look at how much we actually re-examined policy, there was actually very little re-examination. And so the 80-20 split between highways and transit, that hasn't been reconsidered in 30 plus years. The flow of resources to states, we assume states are the best decision makers for federal formula dollars, but maybe we should be thinking about that again. So I hope that if the presidential candidates can achieve a focus on this issue at some point, I hope that there'll be more conversation about what we need to do at the policy level, not just at the funding level, to really make an impact.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with this focus.
Sure. Thank you.